All right, welcome everybody to the next one on our 301 webinar series for the Alliance for Clinical Education. We're extremely excited today because we have Barbara Barzansky here from the LCME to talk to us about accreditation process. And so with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to her. Just a little housekeeping issue. If you do have questions that crop up while she's talking, please use the reaction to raise your hand so that way your face moves up to the top and she can let you ask. But otherwise, there will be a lot of time at the end, she said, to be able to answer any questions that you might have. With that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk about accreditation, but what we're going to talk about is not only the specifics of accreditation, but some of the ways that you all, depending on your roles, are going to be involved in it, or have been involved in it, or if you have something coming up, will be involved in it. So let's think about accreditation, but first let's get into some of the background. And these are things, if you've been part of this series, you've seen before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. There's a credit statement and a disclosure statement, and I can happily affirm that I don't have a conflict of interest in any of these issues. And the general goals of the session, and it looks like you've been involved in this for 3 years. So this is, from what I hear from Gary, the last year, but there are still some sessions to come. And this is the things that have happened already. And if you look at those titles, and we won't spend time looking at them, but there are a lot of things that we're going to be touching on in this session. And so you may have heard about some of the things I'm going to talk about already. And again, this was based on the guidebook. The guidebook was specifically directed toward people who are clerkship directors. What I'm going to talk about is much more general, and it's really going to be aimed at clinical teachers, people who have a variety of roles in the medical education program in teaching and assessing and evaluating programs. So first, for those of you who are not accreditation gurus, talk a little bit about what the LCME is. Then talk about the different roles that clinical faculty and other people who are clinical teachers might have in the accreditation process for, and I'm talking specifically about MD granting medical schools. Most of you may know there are also DO granting medical schools, and they have their own accrediting body. That body uses standards that are not that different from the LCMEs, but they have a whole different process and a group of people involved in it. And then talk about some of the LCME elements that are of relevance to you in your variety of roles as a clinical faculty member, clinical teacher, and what would be expected of you in that particular role for meeting the intent of these elements. Now, the intent of the element really is LCME speak for what the LCME expects to be in place and how it expects those things to work. So we'll be spending time when we go through the different elements thinking about that. So the LCME itself is really a committee. It's 21 people who form a committee that's co-sponsored by the AMA and the Association of American Medical Colleges. So the staff, of which I am one, are employed by one of the sponsoring organizations. The people who make the decisions for the LCME, and Dr. Cox is one of them who happens to be on the session today, are 17 professional members. And these are people who have experience in medical education and usually administrative positions at an MD granting medical school. So they may be the medical school dean, they may be the associate dean of something, medical education, student affairs, and or senior faculty. There are 2 public members who are people who have no ties to the medical education system, to medical education organizations. They're people who can bring a public perspective and say, well, let's think about what the public would want or need in the context of a particular LCME expectation. And then there are fourth-year medical students or final-year medical students, people who've been through the clinical years, been through the rest of the curriculum, and can bring the student perspective to make sure that the LCME doesn't forget the student voice and be able to speak up if there are issues that relate to students. So this group together makes decisions about LCME accreditation status for the right now 158 LCME accredited medical schools. The LCME accredits medical education programs, what we say, leading to the MD degree, because medical schools may have other programs associated with them. They may have allied health programs. They may have other schools of public health. They may have other groups that are accredited by their own special accrediting body. There are 93 accreditation elements that are organized under 12 standards. And those accreditation elements are the sum total of the things that medical schools are held to. And they run the gamut between the administration and governance of a medical school, the curriculum, student services, resources that allow a medical school to function. So in other words, they allow a very broad-based picture of what it takes to make a medical school work and make a medical school's educational program function. So typically, medical schools go through a full LCME review of those 93 elements every 8 years. And the people that I think are on this webinar are people who are very deeply involved in this process. Clerkship directors, clinical faculty who have a role in medical school curriculum delivery and quality assurance, and have a role in preparing for LCME reviews. So in other words, what we're going to be doing is looking at the LCME accreditation elements through the lens of each of those roles and see how that contributes to both an ongoing quality medical education program and a review of an accreditation program, of an LCME accreditation activity at a medical school. So if you happen to be coming up for an accreditation process or even thinking about it, there are certain activities that every school goes through in that 8-year review. And starting about 2 years before or 18 months before, schools complete what we call the data collection instrument, or DCI. And that's a detailed questionnaire that includes information that the school provides for each of those 93 elements. So they are under each particular accreditation element. There's a series of questions that maybe tell us about or give us data about this particular issue. Students themselves are doing a separate survey, which allows them to agree or disagree now with whether certain things are in place that the LCME thinks are important for students to have. Do they have some information about student mistreatment policies? Do they have a place to study? Do they have a curriculum that seems organized to them and it relates to the educational program objectives? So this is a switch from people who have been through and will go through, at least for the next year, the LCME process. It had been satisfaction, and now it's moving more toward a set of very concrete agreements or disagreement statements about what exists at the medical school. And this is something the LCME has had webinars for faculty about in the recent past. So it's a lot of data. There's a 200+ page DCI that schools complete, which is then used by the school to look at each of the elements to make a school determined assessment of whether there are institutional strengths that they would like to call out, or some challenges related to each of those elements. So in other words, data collection and self-study are the cornerstones of the US accreditation process. And just about any accrediting body that's recognized by the United States Department of Education, as the LCME is going to be doing pretty much the same thing, collecting data and having a self-study where the institution itself gets to make some determinations of how well the school is doing. But then that information, that very detailed DCI and other documents are reviewed by what we call a survey team. It's an external group that reviews the school materials and visits the school to talk to a large number of institutional stakeholders. And that will include clerkship directors, junior clinical faculty, and residents, to get a more 360-degree image of the school as an institution and its educational program as to how well it's working. The team will then write a report with evidence for school performance in each of the 93 elements. So in other words, the school has done its own self-assessment. An independent group comes in and looks at the same things and sees if they come to the same conclusions. And then the school report goes to the LCME, who then looks at that school report and sees if they agree with what the survey team found. So the LCME is the final decision maker about accreditation status and other things related to school performance. So in other words, it's a self-assessment followed by a peer review process. If you're a clinical faculty member, a clinical teacher, or someone who works in the clinical education system, like a clerkship coordinator, for example, you're going to have a variety of roles in the functioning of the clinical education program and the functioning of the medical education program as a whole. So you may have a role as a teacher supervisor of medical students in required clerkships. You may have a role of a clerkship director, which probably means you're also a clinical teacher. Or you may also have a role as part of curriculum governance. In other words, you're a member of the curriculum committee or a member of its clinical subcommittee who is making judgments and helping determine whether the job that's being done for the clerkships meets your own standards, many of which relate to LCME expectations. So in other words, a person who has a clinical role may have a number of these jobs in the educational program for medical students. And the specific accreditation elements that are going to be relevant to those particular roles and the particular things that you do in that role are going to be dependent on what the LCME's expectations are for that given element. So what we're going to do is give some examples. And again, if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll be spending some time at the end kind of trying to wrap it up. But there are going to be some standards and elements and their associated elements that we're going to talk about that relate to several big buckets. One is the clinical learning environment, or how do you make sure that that learning environment is positive for students? And we're going to concentrate on the clinical learning environment because that's the area that you're most involved in. Clerkship objectives. Do you specify what students are supposed to be learning in your particular clerkship, and how does that relate to the clinical education expectations in general? The process of teaching students, assessing students, and student supervision. How do you make sure that your educational program is working, is teaching what you want it to teach, that students are assessed based on what you want them to learn, and that when they're in the clinical environment, they are appropriately supervised. So they are doing what you think they should be doing and making sure that they are not left on their own to do it independently, unless you have made the judgment that they are ready for it. Program evaluation and management is how well your clerkship is doing, how well the educational program is doing in the clinical setting, clinical context, and how is it managed? Who's responsible for making decisions about clinical education? And are those decisions leading to something that works well in that students are both taught and learn what you want them to learn? And then there's faculty. What are the expectations for clinical faculty that assure that you have enough faculty, that you have faculty who know what they're supposed to be doing, and you have brought them into the medical schools system to make sure that people who are faculty members are able to be both prepared and evaluated as part of their roles, whatever those roles might be. So these are big buckets, and we won't deal with all the elements that deal in each of these buckets, but we'll talk just about some that are good examples. Okay, the learning environment. The LCME is very concerned that the learning environment is constructed and carried out so that there's no barrier to student learning. And so there are really a couple of elements that deal in that. And just to say that if you ever want to know the language of the elements, the LCME documents are all on its website. And its website has a document called Functions and Structure of a Medical School, which is each of the 93 elements, the exact language of it. And so we're going to be talking about the particular elements, and they're numbered. Standard 3, where elements 3.5 and 3.6 live, are about the educational and learning environment. So for element 3.5 and 3.6, we're looking at both the learning environment writ large. In other words, what are the characteristics of the setting where students learn? And we'll focus in for our purposes around the clinical learning environment. And then 3.6 is really about student mistreatment. It's a subset of the learning environment where specific behaviors that are not conducive to student learning may be occurring, and there's a need to make sure that you know that there's a problem and deal with it. So clerkship directors and faculty will have a very important role in the following. In other words, students learn in environments that are free of behaviors associated with mistreatment. The medical school and the various clinical subcomponents of it need to know what's going on in the learning environment to make sure that there aren't specific behaviors, and those behaviors tend to be listed in a document called the Association of American Medical Colleges Medical School Graduation Questionnaire. They're very specific behaviors that are considered inappropriate. Sexist, racist language, not providing a fair judgment of a student based on their gender or their racial ethnic characteristics or other things. So there are a certain set of behaviors. If you aren't familiar with the GQ, you should look at it. The learning environment should be free of those behaviors. But then there's a bigger context of the learning environment where the school itself is defining particular professional attributes you want students to develop. They should have integrity, be altruistic. Schools come up with a whole set of lists. Some have been developed by different specialty groups. Some are just, functions of a particular school. But there are certain attributes you want students to develop, and you are teaching to them and assessing whether students have acquired them. But you also want the learning environment to not somehow act against students being able to acquire those particular professional attributes. So clerkship evaluations and different kinds of data gathering can assist in monitoring whether the learning environment supports student professional development. So you're going to want to know if the learning environment is, in the student's mind, conducive to their development of these particular behaviors. And the particular data from these evaluations are reviewed by individual clerkships, the clerkship directors subcommittee, and the curriculum committee. So what you're doing there is trying to understand from both the perspective of faculty and the perspective of students whether the learning environment supports student professional growth and professional development. And you are able, by your evaluation mechanisms, to determine if there's a generalized problem somewhere or that problem is more specific. So, for example, and we'll come back to this when we deal in comparing what goes on at different clinical sites, you'll be able to see if for a given discipline or for a given clerkship site, there may be problems in any of these areas that we just talked about. So you'll be able to get feedback, but you'll also be involved in assessing student performance related to their professionalism, because just about every clerkship evaluation I've seen has something, whether it's general or much more specific, related to professional behaviors and professionalism. So in other words, you can assess a student's professionalism, professional behaviors as part of their clerkship evaluation, but you're also assessing the environment in which they learn to make sure there isn't anything getting in the way, so that appropriate role modeling is occurring and appropriate teaching is occurring as well. So clinical learning environment, again, is a constellation of issues that the LCME holds very important, because it does agree that that affects students' ability to learn. But what they learn is based in your clerkship learning objectives and the required clinical encounters that you think they should have. So this is a constellation of elements that comes from the standards related to the structure of the curriculum and the evaluation of the curriculum. So clerkship faculty and the clerkship director work together to develop particular learning objectives for a given clerkship that the LCME says should be stated in outcome-based terms. Outcome-based terms means you set it in a way that you can then evaluate it, assess it for the student, and evaluate it for whether it actually occurs in the clinical setting. So in other words, it's specific enough that you can identify particular assessment methods that you might use to determine whether a given medical student has met these learning objectives. So you've defined the learning objectives. The learning objectives are linked to the educational program objectives. You know, as an educational program, the curriculum committee, or whatever you call it, has developed a set of broad-based educational program objectives, which are the things that you want a student to acquire as they journey through the however many years of the curriculum you have, mostly 4, but sometimes 3. And so by the end of that journey, you want to know that students have acquired those particular areas of knowledge, skill, and behavior, and professionalism, for example, that you think they should. But to do that, you need to know where you teach them. And therefore, that's the basis of linking your learning objectives for a given course, or in your case, a given clerkship, to the educational program objectives. So someone could say for a particular objective, educational program objective related to professionalism, these learning objectives occur throughout the curriculum, before the clerkships, perhaps, during the clerkships, and maybe after, if you have a phase of the curriculum that is a phase after the students complete the required clerkships. So in other words, Element 6.1 says you need to develop learning objectives. Element 8.2 says you need to link those learning objectives to the educational program objectives. Clerkship faculty, by discipline and then for the clerkship year, have sat down and say, okay, for the students in my clerkship, what categories of clinical conditions do they actually need to see a real patient and work with that real patient at some level? And what are the skills and procedures that they need to actually do at some level? And when I say at some level, it means what's the student's role in this clinical encounter? Do they watch it? Do they assist in it? Do they actually do it? And that is an expectation for the clerkship and then the clerkship directors group as a whole to sort out, in other words, what in a particular surgical procedure would a student do? Do you want them to just see it? Do you want them to assist at it? So in other words, for all your required clinical experiences you want a student to have, and for all the skills and procedures you want them to somehow interact with, you've defined what the student's role is. And that is core not only for helping students understand what they're supposed to do and helping faculty understand what students are supposed to do, but also for supervising students when they get in the clinical setting. And we'll come back to that. So in other words, one of the things that is associated with developing learning objectives for your clerkship is developing this specific set of clinical encounters and clinical skills that you want a student to master or interact with at some level. And then your clerkship directors committee can kind of think about it in terms of, okay, hypertension. Is it only in internal medicine, for example? Is it internal medicine and family medicine? There might be some things that overlap across clerkships, and that's fine. You just need to find a way to sort out whether a student has actually interacted with that kind of patient somewhere and make sure that they are documented that they're doing that. So student completion of encounter skills is monitoring as part of the assessment of students and evaluated to ensure the adequacy of the patient base. So if you say students should see X, Y, and Z, and at a particular site they can't see Z, it's going to be a discussion point for clinical clerkship faculty to say, is this too specialized a thing that we expect students to interact with a patient about? Maybe we'll teach it some other way. So in other words, the discussion of what students should actually encounter in the clinical setting and what can be experienced in other ways, for example, in a simulation center or through case studies, is something that's a discussion point at the individual clerkship level, but it's also a discussion point at the clerkship directors committee and at the curriculum committee, who's got to look across clerkships and say, yeah, it looks like a nice complete set of the clinical encounters we want our students to go through, or we see a hole, or we see a duplication that may not be necessary. So in other words, you're getting all three levels participating in creating a clinical curriculum that is complete, that is reasonable to achieve, and that meets the objectives you set for the educational program. Okay, so now we're getting into the issue of actually teaching students. And this is where residents come in, because residents will often have a role in teaching and supervising students, and they need to be prepared for that, specifically prepared for that teaching role. So there's an expectation they receive the learning objectives and the list of required clinical experiences for the clerkship and get an orientation to teaching skills. And that participation at both the clerkship level and the institutional level needs to be monitored. So you make sure that every resident who's going to be supervising a medical student has gotten that information, gotten the objectives, gotten the required clinical experiences, but also knows a little bit about how to assess students and if evaluation, what that clinical evaluation requires. And so, in other words, residents are both teachers and learners, and they need to be prepared for the role that they're going to play in the clerkship setting. The issue of medical student assessment, in other words, how a given student is. In progress. I think there's an echo somewhere. I don't think it's me. The observation of student clinical skills and the LCME, while there are going to be a lot of clinical skills you may want a student to master, the LCME tends to focus on history taking and physical examination as a way to, if you do that, make sure that a student for your given clerkship has access to assessment of those things. And it's maybe done during regular clerkship activities. In other words, somebody watches a student on the floor do an H&P on a given patient, or part of an H&P if you have divided up the parts of the physical examination based on your clerkships. And there also may be an OSCE, an objective structured clinical examination, that is done either at the end of a clerkship or at the end of a given clinical year. So in other words, the expectation is that student clinical skills are observed and that there needs to be documentation that has occurred. Now, if observations are for formative feedback, in other words, if the student is being observed so you can tell them how well they're doing, should be that observation should be accompanied by some kind of feedback to that student based on what you've expected them to do and how well they've met that expectation. So at the clerkship level, completion of all observations should be monitored to make sure that each student is observed at the level that you have specified. So if you say in internal medicine, in OBGYN, they need to do X number of patient encounters where they do an H&P or a part of an H&P, you've decided on that as part of your clerkship directors committee, perhaps. And then you've developed a system to make sure that those observations occur. And then you've got a system to monitor whether they've actually happened. And different ways to monitor are when a student does a clinical skill or clinical H&P, and someone watches them, that may be entered into a database, or there may be a form that's filled out that's signed by the student. And that's entered into some system where the clerkship coordinator or the clerkship director can look at it and see whether every student has been observed at the level that you have set as faculty for that clerkship, and that the clinical governance, the clerkship directors committee, and the clinical curriculum and the curriculum committee has decided is sufficient and appropriate. So in other words, students need to be observed. That observation needs to be monitored to make sure it's happening. And students need to get some feedback, and we'll come back to this in a minute, based on, did they do in that clinical encounter what you expected them to do, and how can they improve? And this is element 9.7, is medical student assessment and feedback. So in other words, there's an expectation that students get at least formal mid-clerkship feedback. And that feedback may be done by however you set up your clerkship structure. So it may be done by the clerkship director, or it may be done by the site director if you have students in a distributed clinical setting, or it might be done by the student's individual preceptor. The issue being that, you need to make sure that whoever is doing that is knowledgeable about what that student is supposed to have done and can give the student appropriate feedback about whether they've met the expectations. So the feedback should be based on the assessor's knowledge of the student. So they have to have seen them do it. And if it's mid-clerkship feedback and the clerkship director is doing the feedback but hasn't actually worked with the student, someone's got, or someone's have got to give that clerkship director information about what is, how that student is doing and what the student could do to improve. Relate to the clerkship objectives. So in other words, there are certain parts of the clerkship objectives that can be assessed based on observing a student do a clinical encounter. The student, that assessor needs to pay attention to those and what's expected and whether the student has done it as well as they could or has some gaps. And note issues for follow-up, such as the status of completion of required clinical experiences, but also how well their clerkship knowledge and clerkship skills are developing. Because the bottom line for the LCME is that feedback needs to be related to what the student is supposed to achieve. And students note this, and they do in their own survey look at whether the feedback that they've received has anything to do with the clerkship objectives and has anything to do with what they have to do to get a good clerkship grade, to show that they've met the clerkship objectives. So in other words, the linkage of feedback to the expectations for a summative, a grading experience in the clerkship is very important that that link be tight. So the provision also of mid-clerkship feedback needs to be monitored at the department level and then centrally in terms of, again, the clerkship directors committee and the curriculum committee, because when a clerkship is being evaluated, that might be part of the evaluation process. Did every student get mid-clerkship feedback? Did every student think, hopefully, that the feedback was useful, helped them improve, was specific enough so that they understood what they needed to do better? And so how is it monitored? It could be done at the time of feedback where there's a form that both the student and the person who's giving the feedback complete that goes into a database, for example, or goes to a central system that's often monitored by the clerkship coordinator. Or there might be a question on the clerkship evaluation that asks the student, did you get mid-clerkship feedback? Because there's certainly a question on the AAMCGQ, which is for fourth year medical students, to say, did you get feedback on your clerkship? Which is sometimes a long time for students to remember. And so when the LCME does a review of medical schools, it asks the student survey to ask that question as well, which would be completed by third year medical students whose memory is probably a lot better than a fourth year medical student who's, completing a questionnaire just prior to graduation. So in other words, this is typical of how the LCME handles things. It says something should happen. It expects schools to have a system for that thing to happen, in this case, mid-clerkship feedback, and it wants a system to monitor whether it actually did happen for every student. And so it was the same for 9.4, assessment of clinical skills, and it's the same thing for feedback, a system where you want to make sure that what you've expected to happen is actually happening. Medical student, this one it's a very specific one, but it turned out to be a very important one because quite some time ago, the LCME was talking to students who said, I didn't get my clerkship grades for 6 months, and I was kind of worried. I wanted to go into that discipline, but I didn't have my grades, so I didn't know how well I did. So it put in a specific element that has two parts. One is the expectation that at all required courses and clerkships, grades should be available to students within 6 weeks. And so there's a system at the medical school to make sure that pre-clerkship grades get turned in, but clerkship grades get turned in. And that means that clinical evaluations need to be turned in so that they can be folded into the clerkship grade, which is complicated for some schools that have a dispersed educational system where there are a lot of people who are responsible for completing those clinical clerkship evaluations. So how do schools do that? The system usually includes some form of monitoring when the grades are submitted and some form of gentle nudging of people who have not completed their evaluations. And then the nudging gets more specific and more concrete as the deadline approaches. So that tends to work. And the ability for schools to get their grades within 6 weeks when they have a system where it's being attended to early on tends to allow that to happen. But there's another component of this, and that's fair and timely. So fair means that students understand how they're going to be assessed and graded in the clerkship. It's very explicit that the system is applied consistently so that everybody who's grading a student within a given clerkship, if it's more than one person, knows what it means to have a particular level of student performance, and that students think their mid-clerkship feedback is relevant to how they're going to be graded. Because if the mid-clerkship feedback is not relevant, they can't or feel they can't improve enough to get a good grade in their clerkship. And so for fairness, individual providing feedback, which goes back to element 9.7, must be familiar with both the student and how that given student is doing, and what the clerkship requirements and grading expectations are, and be trained to provide meaningful feedback. And so, in other words, the LCME elements, while they come one at a time, really do relate to each other, because for a student to believe that clerkship grading is fair, they need to have had their feedback, have understood how they're going to be graded, and understand that that feedback really matters in whether they're going to be getting a good grade or not. So all these tie together, and it's a system across Standard 9, which is one related to student assessment, that allows a school to build on those particular activities to end up in a place where a student feels comfortable. Okay, so student supervision is also under Standard 9, and that is an expectation that there's a supervision policy that's very explicit, and you decide what goes into it in terms of, direct or indirect supervision. Direct means somebody in the room, indirect means somebody's outside the room but available. Define for your students what they can and can't do, because there may be some things a student was never being allowed to do. And faculty need to know this, and residents need to know this who supervise that student. So the linkage to 6.2 is very tight. 6.2 says, what do you want a student to encounter in the clinical setting? What skills do you want a student to be involved in? And what level is that involvement? And so that level directly relates to your supervision policy. There are things that you will never have a student do, perform in a particular skill. There was one school I evaluated where one of the required clinical experiences was a hysterectomy, and it had the student perform. That did not go over well because they hadn't thought about what particular role a student should have in a particular operative procedure. And they didn't mean, I don't think, for a student to do the hysterectomy. They wanted the student to be in there and maybe scrub in. But again, the precision is important. You know, if you list your particular required clinical experiences to make sure that you are clear on what a student needs to do, then supervision is a common language among the students and the faculty and residents who teach them. So the policy needs to be clear and set boundaries. It needs to recognize that students who are just starting their clinical clerkship year may be less prepared to do things than a student who's finishing it. So the ability to understand where a student is in that continuum of skills development, and that needs to be a shared perception among the people who are teaching and the students who are, learning. But there's also a need for a student to be comfortable saying, wait, I can't do this. I'm not ready. So there should be a process for students to report concerns about supervision if they don't think they're getting supervised carefully enough, or if they're being expected to do things that are outside their level of development. And they need to be able to do that immediately if something is an emergent situation, or at other times through the clerkship evaluation. In other words, supervision is again something that clerkship evaluations often ask about in terms of our students feeling comfortable with the supervision that they have. All right, let's come back to comparability across sites. Clerkships often don't all occur where students are all in one place learning the clerkship material, and therefore the same people are teaching them and assessing them. And it's a very simple system. So within a given clerkship, if students are at more than one site, there's an expectation that they have comparable educational experiences and equivalent methods of assessment. That comparability requires the use of clinical. The ability of students to have a clinical experiences where they're not disadvantaged because they're in a particular place. They can't see some patients, they don't get particular content, they're assessed differently than people in different sites. There needs to be a system to evaluate whether there is consistency. So those measures need to be developed at the clerkship level or centrally to ensure that there is consistency across sites. Faculty who teach and supervise students need to have a faculty appointment if they're going to be a primary supervisor or assessor during required clerkships. And the reason for that is that students need to have a consistent experience, as we just said, and therefore faculty who teach them need to be accountable to the clerkship director that they're going to be teaching what the clerkship learning objectives are and assessing what the clerkship requirements are as well. So in other words, there needs to be a system in place to make sure that Dr. X, who's going to be supervising and assessing students at a given location, has a faculty appointment and therefore is accountable for doing what the clerkship director and what the clinical curriculum is and requires. So there should be a way for clerkship directors to know if Dr. X has a current faculty appointment. And that's often somehow a database in the faculty affairs office or somewhere else where that can be checked. And people who will be, or new faculty, for example, need to make sure that they've completed their paperwork for their faculty appointment so that they are able to participate as a supervisor in a clerkship. So in other words, again, a system to make sure that people who will teach and assess medical students have a faculty appointment and that the clerkship director knows that that faculty appointment is current. There's another element that really deals in the fact that faculty who teach and assess medical students should not also be their healthcare provider. And that is really an element that relates to conflict of interest. So a physician who's provided health services to a student may have no role in assessment of that student. And that assessment includes in the clerkship, but also, for example, as someone who's on the promotions committee, who may be asked to make a decision about student advancement or perhaps student dismissal. So there's a non-involvement policy and there's procedures to implement it that is shared with faculty, and the implementation procedures are could be both prospective and retrospective, which means before a student is assigned to a particular faculty preceptor, student and the preceptor should be asked, have you ever provided health services in the broadest sense to this student? Do you have a conflict of interest with this student in another way? For example, it's a relative, someone you have worked with before. Retrospective is a way to check to say, can you, in a clerkship evaluation that a faculty member is filling out, and they're about to do their clinical evaluation, they could be asked, did you ever provide healthcare to this student? And if you click yes, you can't provide that clinical evaluation. And so, in other words, there's a variety of ways to implement this particular expectation. There are some abilities in particular situations where it might be an emergent situation where you would provide healthcare. But in other words, as a general policy, the issue of conflict of interest is something the LCME is concerned about, and therefore there needs to be a way to make sure that someone who has a conflict of interest, including providing health services, is not also evaluating students. So last but not least, there's some take-home messages. Clinical faculty and clerkship directors and residents need to be familiar with medical school policies and procedures. And we've talked about a whole bunch of them related to clinical activities that tie directly to LCME accreditation elements. So in other words, there needs to be policies in place. There needs to be procedures to implement those policies. And there needs to be a way for the medical school to check on that. And participation in the following areas are important for faculty. They need to be involved in policy development, CQI and QA activities, and accreditation reviews. And I think we have a question. So Dr. Pangaro, please.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm on the page before. Could you explain more what's the nature of the conflict of interest if a faculty member has taken care of the student and then is involved in their assessment? What is the nature of that conflict?
Okay, well, the LCME defines providing health services to a student as a conflict of interest because it might be that you know something that's perhaps to the detriment of a student, or one might perceive that it is. Or it might be that because you've provided health service to this student, you have a positive view of that student. You know more about them than you know about another student who you don't have a history
I
with.
see. So
And
it's not really a conflict of interest. It's not that the physician has some financial benefit or something. It is that the observations are somehow contaminated. It's not
Exactly.
truly a conflict in the traditional sense of a conflict of interest. I got
Yeah,
it. Thank
it's
you.
not a financial conflict of interest. Although if the physician has a relationship that is financial with that student's family, that might be
Sure.
an issue.
Sure.
But this one is more a more personal kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it says something about you don't think you should trust the professionalism and the diagnostic skill of the teacher. The assumption is that they are contaminated.
Well, the assumption is that they could be, and the problem could be that someone else, another student who knows that there has been a relationship between that faculty member and that student will say, well, he got a good grade, it's because he knows the person, because they're his
Sure.
healthcare provider. So
Yeah.
in other words, you want to make sure that the relationship doesn't put pressure on either side of the equation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Gary, anything? We're
Yeah,
coming.
I've got two questions that were posed in the chat directly to me that I'd like to ask. The first one deals with mistreatment, and the question was that students report uncomfortable situations as mistreatment sometimes. So how is that actually defined? Is it public embarrassment? Is it, because if they're uncomfortable, sometimes they think that that's for some reason being mistreated.
That is something that the medical school is expected to come up with a set of definitions. Now, the AAMC GQ includes public embarrassment, or the LCME is a little bit more focused there and looks for more of those other behaviors that are more specific. Inappropriate comments, inappropriate actions, some form of discriminatory behavior. But it's something that the school should define and somehow list when they're developing a mistreatment policy. That policy should clearly include what they think is going to be an inappropriate, and then it does link to behaviors, an inappropriate behavior.
Right. And the other question is related to the direct observation of skills. Is an HMP required for every court clerkship to be directly observed?
The LCME, I think, has really thought about it that way. In other words, not necessarily a complete HMP, but someone is looking at whatever the clerkship has been assigned. In other words, abdominal exam for surgery, pelvic exam for OBGYN. Some schools do OSCE, in other words, if there's an OSCE clerkship. But again, there are various ways it happens, but the inclusion of at least some observation of real patients is looked for in given clerkships.
Sounds good. Anybody else have other questions? I know we're at the top of the hour and we need to wrap up, but I wanted to make sure if you have a pressing question, you can.
If I might ask a little bit more about the conflict of interest. So we have a fairly strict policy which says if you've ever provided healthcare that you cannot evaluate a student. Does it need to be that strict? I mean, if someone saw a patient in urgent care 5 years ago, would that still qualify?
There is a clause there that I would read to you if I pull out my standards. And what it says is excluding exceptional circumstances. So exceptional circumstances could be a student in a rural rotation where they need specialty care and they're working with that specialist. But you as a clerkship and you as a curriculum committee need to define what those exceptional circumstances are.
Thank you.
There's another question in the chat. Are residents permitted to formally evaluate students for summative evaluation?
Not as the only evaluator, but they can, you know, if you allow it in your school, they can contribute a clinical evaluation as long as they're trained. And they can be observers as long as they're trained, just like the faculty would need to be trained for what you want that observation to include.
Okay, I love the fact that you keep bringing up the issue of training the faculty and our residents to do these things. So how much documentation does the LCME want to see related to what sorts of trainings are offered for completing or learning how to do clinical direct observation evaluations?
Okay, if we're talking about residents, the resident training that I mentioned under, which again could be a lot more, or than the how to give feedback and whatever, needs to be documented by somebody, and that who that somebody is needs to be reported to the LCME as part of that element. They don't need to see like sign-in sheets of hundreds of residents all over the place. What they do need is there's a system that somebody's watching, and it's usually the DIO or somebody, because again, ACGME requires residents to be prepared, and so there's an interaction between the clerkship director and the resident training system. For faculty, there is an expectation for faculty development, but it doesn't require that every faculty member be trained, but it does require that faculty be evaluated. And so if they need training because somehow those evaluations aren't as stellar as they could be, there needs to be a system for remediation of problem. And if, again, for clinical observation, if there was problems identified there, either because it didn't happen or it didn't meet expectations, then there would need to be some kind of fix to the system.
Excellent. All right, well, we're over time. Again, thank you so much for taking time to do this. And I think everybody's gotten some good nuggets to take away from this. And we will make sure that the recording is posted by tomorrow. But we really truly appreciate you taking the time, Barbara. I know how busy you are with the LCME stuff as it is, so much appreciated.
My pleasure. And you all do a really important job. So thank you for participating. Bye.